Hi, good day, everyone. Uh, we will start today's session. Um, my name is Ricardo Jacobs. I am based at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I will be chairing today's plenary session. Just a reminder that today's session number 16 will be having interpretation, and you just have to click on the interpretation icon to access it. I want to we've had an incredible few past 3 days, focusing really on interpreting the world, analyzing the logic of capital accumulation, and the type of resistance that it generates. In this session, we will shift our attention to reflect on how to change the world, as someone said in the past, or geared towards a vision for future society. And so the question is, how do we envisage building emancipatory alternatives without creating necessarily blueprints for the future? One can say the same person who said our objective is not just to interpret the world, but we're also trying to change it, reminded us that every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. So one can interpret that to mean that alternatives to capitalism will emerge from within capitalism and from the struggles of oppressed people and subaltern groups. So today's session is really an invitation for us to have a conversation on rethinking the nature of capitalism, but particularly focusing on emancipatory alternatives. And we are very honored and to have a panel of distinguished scholar activists that will help us think through how one can begin to think about alternatives, and just to remind us that today's theme is towards agrarian climate justice, strengthening alliance for an anti-capitalist approach to climate change. So I just briefly want to introduce our four panelists. Firstly, we have Diana Ojeda, who is a Colombian feminist geographer working at the intersection of critical agrarian studies and feminist political ecology. She holds a PhD from Clark University in the United States and is currently associate professor at the Interdisciplinary Center for Development Studies of Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. Then we have, we're pleased to have Mamadou Goita. Dr. Goita is a development socioeconomist from Mali, a university teacher and researcher. He's currently the executive director of the Institute for Research and the Promotion of Alternatives in Development. And he works on various issues and contributed to many economic and social studies, researches, and evaluation processes in Africa and the rest of and other parts of the continent. And he's also been an activist in the peasant and farmers movement within the region of West Africa. Then we have Kasia Pavroke, whose research is based in Bangladesh, where she works in partnership with Nigeri Kori, the country's largest landless peasant movement. She's an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and is the author of the book Threatening the Dystopias, The Global Politics of Climate Change Adaptation in Bangladesh. That was published last year in 2021 by Cornell University Press. And then we have Katie Sandwell, which all of us know, is a senior project officer with the Transnational Institute. Her work focused especially on land and resource justice, food sovereignty, oceans, and just transitions. Katie holds a master's in environmental studies from York University in Canada, that focuses on food sovereignty and local food movement. She has lived in Canada, Germany, the UK, and the Netherlands, has been involved in a range of food community and environmental and social justice organizations. So we're really, spoiled for choice today, and we hope to have an interesting conversation amongst these four panelists. And we will start in the order of the program. And I want to start off just by posing this question to all four of you. And I will start with Diana Ojeda. We have, as I've said, we have started talking about the logic of capitalism, how it operates, and the type of resistance that are generated. But to link it to our theme today, one can start by just asking the question then, what is an anti-capitalist approach or perspective to climate change and agrarian climate justice today? And we can couple that with who would be the social forces or groups that would lead an anti-capitalist and agrarian climate justice struggles. And related to those are how do we bring together multi-class, gender, sexuality, race, indigeneity component of the struggle, resistance together based on an anti-capitalist approach or politics to climate change. So I know that's a mouthful, but let us disentangle what is the politics of an anti-capitalist. And we will start with Diana.
Thank you very much. I apologize, my connection is not the best, so probably my camera is not working. I hope you're hearing me fine. I want to start by thanking conference organizers for bringing us together for this super relevant and urgent conversation. And I feel very encouraged to see that we're actually building these bridges between environmental studies and critical agrarian studies. I think that sometimes it sounds obvious, but it's not usually what happens. So this remains a pending work, and it is fantastic to know that here we're having this conversation about how the climate conversation is about a land conversation, and that is definitely refreshing. If we want to think about anti-capitalist ways out of the problem, I think we need to understand the ways in which also we are suggesting capitalist solutions. And that has been a point that has been widely addressed and in detail in these days in the conference. To me, one of the things that I would like to point out is how we tend to reproduce these narratives, these capitalist narratives of solution, and that again has been widely addressed. What I think that I can contribute to is to pointing to social reproduction and how the point, of course, to change it definitely needs to address issues of nature necessarily, of care necessarily, of that sustains life. And that has been one of the key points of political ecology in Latin America, this feminist political ecology in Latin America, which is a big field. I think it is a growing, body of work and work that happens definitely not within the limits of academia. And this idea of putting life at the center that is widely used by feminist movements that are articulating environmental struggles, with land struggles, with the defense of territory, with the defense of life, is to me one of the key points when we ask where can we change, where can we find solutions, where can we find who's changing and which ideas are changing the world. Because it is not about just green or nature-based solutions. It is about precisely what sustains life on a daily basis. And to me, that results a powerful source of inspiration and a powerful source of transformation. Perhaps I think that I would argue then for for paying more attention to what feminist political ecology is doing in different sites. This is you know an old idea, of course, and political ecology started with questions about the scarcity and about the environmental crisis that were necessarily political, and how in the road we lost questions about land and labor. I'm not so sure. So this articulation that Latin American feminisms are suggesting, I think, is very, very powerful, because precisely shows how capitalism is necessarily racial, colonial capitalism, how it is based on this alliance with patriarchy. And there is where I think we should be looking at.
Thank you, Diana. And we will ask now Mamadou the same question. What is the anti-capitalist approach to agrarian climate change or agrarian climate justice today? Just your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I think we had a fantastic week listening to very relevant conversations during these days, and then they highlighted on different angles, how capitalism is manifesting itself using different angles at social, economic, political, and as has been mentioned by Diana, on the political ecology perspective that has been done. So we can see that the very extreme manifestation of capitalism is on the false solution that has been highlighted to some extent. Some of them more deeply, but others less. And we all know that if you look at what's happened, particularly in the African continent, you will see that there is a lot that can be done. And beside this manifestation, that the deep causes that have been highlighted is from the historical trajectory of Africa itself. For a long time, this extravism of the economic sector particularly, but also the social and cultural dimensions of this continent has led to what we are facing today. So we can go back in the history and find out that it is coming very far in the case of Africa, and that all the solutions that have been proposed have been completely destabilizing all the social structure that we have. So an anti-capitalistic view on that will be how to create conditions just to stop not only what is happening in this first solution, but bringing back this alternative that we have been discussing during this week. Some of them being how to change the paradigms of shifting from the way of accumulation to the way of redistribution of wealth, and how in between all these social, political, and cultural dimensions should be involved in it. For instance, if you look at what's happened in the last years, looking at the carbon trading issue, it has nothing to do with preventing emission from what is happening on the fossil fuel. Look at countries like Nigeria or countries like Mali in the mining, in the gold sector, and so on and so forth. So if you look at what is happening in terms of climate variability, destabilized system that we have, so an anti-capitalist way of looking at it will be probably just to have an approach that is based on multilateralism, religion first, and secondly, how to bring back the states at the center of things, related also to how different social political forces that have been created over this year will be also involved in that. So having said that, if you look at all these things, you will see that there are some social forces, to answer to the second point, that are actually visible related to the food actors, for food justice actors that are here, climate justice actors that are playing a big role, not only in giving awareness on these first solutions that have been highlighted by capitalism, and then to see how some alternatives can be on board creating conditions for collecting data, but also highlighting them in different negotiations. So the food movement, the climate justice movement, the food justice movement, with what fantastic work that farmers groups are doing, actually hand in hand, trying to push for these alternatives will be very important for that. And then we know that this capitalistic, the anti-capitalistic approach cannot work if you don't really consider it as a violent approach. And being a violent approach, that there is a need also to work in a synergical way between different key players. And this means that the issue of gender, the issue of racism, that is also highlighted even today, what is happening in different parts of the world, that need to bring forces between social movement, but also creating conditions for the convergences. The convergences is very, very instrumental in creating conditions just to dismantle what has been created around this false solution. So for me, the convergence of forces is a first step, and creating conditions at national level, but also bringing it at regional and international level will be very critical to dismantle this capitalistic approach that we have so far.
Thank you, Mamadou. We will now hand over and pose the same question to Cassia to focus on what is this politics of anti-capitalist climate change, and who are the classes, social forces that we think can be able to lead us into this approach and the politics of anti-capitalist climate change. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Ricardo, for these really brilliant questions. I'm so happy to be here, and I've enjoyed the conference so much so far. I'm really honored to be in conversation with these brilliant co-panelists today. We have the privilege on our panel of following a set of already really illuminating conversations over the past few days. So we have the opportunity to sort of amplify some of the important insights that have already been said, just as much as to offer new ones. I'm sorry, I'm nursing a cold. So on that note, a couple days ago, Amita was discussing the need to question ideas about viability that are embedded in some discourses of climate action. And I think that this is a really powerful discursive construct that I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking. Specifically, I'll argue that discourses of unviable agrarian climate futures are essential to capitalist responses to climate change, and therefore resisting these discourses is an important starting point for imagining anti-capitalist agrarian climate justice. So as Ricardo said, I work in coastal Bangladesh, where people have historically produced rice in floodplains for many, many generations. And since the 1980s, development agencies have been promoting commercial shrimp aquaculture in this region to replace floodplain rice agriculture. Agencies like the World Bank and USAID have seen this shift as necessary to promoting export-led growth. Now, I probably don't need to explain to this audience how dire the implications have been to food sovereignty and to the people who have relied on this rice agriculture for their subsistence. In addition to these serious social implications, the ecological impacts have been really devastating. Salinity from the shrimp aquaculture kills trees and other plant life and results in these really ecologically devastated monocrop landscapes where essentially nothing else can be produced. This is a story that has been repeated in countless coastal regions around the world, and I see in the list of participants that there are many people who have written about this elsewhere in Latin America and Southeast Asia who are also with us today. So today, and this is where I think that this gets interesting for our discussion here, development agencies have begun calling shrimp aquaculture a climate change adaptation strategy. They base these plans on an associated claim that agriculture in this region is not viable because of climate change and sea level rise. Never mind that the threats to agriculture they address here are directly the result of shrimp aquaculture itself. This is really a very old capitalist trope about agrarian communities. Even as they mobilize the language of climate crisis today, the idea that agriculture isn't viable and that people need to be moved out of farming to work in cities is an idea as old as capitalism itself. And this in turn has been at the heart of the agrarian question and critical agrarian studies since the beginning. Now back to Bangladesh. Peasant movements in this region have been resisting this shift to aquaculture for decades, and these movements today are growing. In many communities throughout the coastal region, farmers are actually managing to move back to rice agriculture away from shrimp in the very same landscapes where farming is being called unviable by development agencies. This is an anti-capitalist approach to agrarian climate justice. To resist the capitalist teleology of climate crisis and ruination, to demand and pursue an alternative future where no future is said to be possible, this is an incredibly powerful political move. It both arrests the institutionalization of imminent disaster, and it also creates new opportunities for surviving and thriving in the face of these threats. In thinking about this politics of viability, recently I've been thinking a lot with scholars of Black ecologies and of Indigenous studies, many of whom have also written about what it means to think about life in an ecology that is thought to have already been ruined. That means seeing climate crisis not as a new and unprecedented threat, but as sort of the next phase in a long history of colonial and extractivist violence. For these scholars, identifying opportunities for pursuing viability in the context of ruination is a key strategy in anti-capitalist visions of climate justice. Now, there's been very little interaction between these literatures and critical agrarian studies, so I think there's a lot more room for exploring these intersections. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And I'll stop here with a brief recap. Demanding and pursuing viability in the face of claims to imminent crisis is itself a powerful politics of climate justice, and one that unites many visions of agrarian justice with other anti-capitalist visions of climate justice.
Thank you, Cassia, and we'll hand over to Katie and really to also concretely also just try and focus on the second part as well, about who are these multi-class characters, but also just to start off, what do you think is an anti-capitalist approach to climate change?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, echoing all of the thoughts so far about what an inspiring discussion this has been so far, and off to a wonderful start today. So thank you everyone for the really fascinating interventions. Indeed, I think on the first question, people have already contributed a great deal. So just to reiterate briefly, I think an anti-capitalist approach to climate change and agrarian justice is one that rejects this false dichotomy between human beings and nature. It's one that understands quite intimately what it's up against and is able to name and to articulate this as capitalism, and to have a kind of grounding analysis there of what that means and of what we are up against. And then, as Diana said so eloquently, I think that this is also one that that an anti-capitalist approach differs so profoundly from the kind of green capitalist and sustainability models that we see, in that while those implicitly are aimed at sustaining capitalism and sustaining the continuation of capitalist accumulation, what an anti-capitalist approach struggles for instead is sustaining life, right? Sustaining the systems of social and natural reproduction that allow human and non-human life both to continue and to continue together. So yeah, that for me is what we are talking about when we talk about an anti-capitalist position here. When it comes to the questions of the social forces who are at the forefront or should lead this, I think Mamadou has already identified a few very interesting actors. Diana has mentioned the relevance of feminist social movements. I think those are extremely important. But I feel as well that there's a bit of a tension here in the question, right, between who are the social forces acted now and who are the people who ought to lead. Because I think, as many of you will be familiar from your work, from your studies, and from your activism, neoliberalism and the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism have given rise to these massive waves of dispossession, right? Such that the real global majority today, growing global majority of people, are basically struggling to make ends meet. We're hearing more and more about this now in the context, again, of the inflation crisis, also in the global north. but we're at this moment where an ever-increasing number of people are struggling with to meet their basic needs of physical and social reproduction. And people have arrived there in a variety of different routes, have arrived in that state, whether from the destruction and dismantling of welfare states, where those have existed predominantly in the global north, whether through expropriation and dispossession of the lands, resources, and territories on which they depended, but also through the increased precaritization of labor, and increasingly, of course, through climate catastrophe. But at the end of the day, the growing majority of mankind is in this situation where a decent and dignified life is completely outside of their reach. So that, aside from being an unprecedented tragedy, it also creates a tremendous potential for collective organizing. But as I think everyone here realizes and recognizes, that is not an automatic process, right? The reality of shared exploitation does not translate automatically into a collective struggle. Instead, this is a huge work of ongoing organizing to animate and to mobilize those groups of people. And by and large, today, that majority remains unorganized by existing social movements, of course, with exceptions. I mean, many are organized, but many more are not. And in a number of contexts, many are being mobilized by the far right around specific domains of difference instead of that shared reality of exploitation and expropriation. I think this is something that social movements are responding to and are deeply aware of. And in all of the climate and agrarian justice movements with whom I work, I see this growing kind of hunger to build those new coalitions and alliances, to build cross intersectional solidarity, and to begin those processes. But those are long, slow, and difficult processes of coalition building that take place in very particular contexts and in the case of particular struggles. So I think this is an incredibly good forum for us here to ask, first of all, and more generally, the question, as you have posed already, Ricardo, of what is to be done. But I think also I would be very interested to explore with all of you in the rest of this conversation the question of specifically what role can activist scholars play here, and what is the unique contribution that activist scholarship can make to enabling and facilitating that process of building new coalitions and new alliances for anti-capitalist alternatives.
Thank you, Katie. And you raise an important point that not all alternatives are inherently progressive, because you have they can be both reactionary and emancipatory, and on the reactionary side we can see the rise of the far right and also trying to transcend and some of the constraints of capitalism. But I really want to and this is the point of that someone says on the side of the left, we can analyze the problem, but we sometimes don't spend enough time to thinking about what should these alternatives be, or alternatively, we don't pay attention to the real movements of people and the types of alternatives that they are putting on the table. So I want to just throw this one question to you before we go to the audience, and I really encourage debate and interaction from the audience to and participants also just to pose their question in the chat, and so that we can have this conversation. So if one think, and here I want to qualify by what I'm saying, if you think in the 20th century and 19th century, there were real alternatives, one can think about the Paris Commune, we can think about different revolutions that people draw on. Some radical thinkers were looking at the past and see where embedded is the alternatives. In the 21st century, I would like to ask all of you is that, and the participants of this conference, like, what are some of these emancipatory alternatives to capitalism that is emerging in different parts of the world in a concrete way? If you can, you know, we are not suggesting that there's a blueprint, but people are also struggling and trying to develop alternatives on the day-to-day basis. I'm not suggesting in the same way we think about the Paris Commune and others, but you know, there's the Zapatistas, one can think about it. Indigenous people all have ways in which they're thinking about alternatives. So just from your own perspective, you know, what are some of these emancipatory alternatives that are emerging, and can one really disentangle some of these elements of that? And I think I'm going to start the other way, just since Katie has left us there, we're going to go back to Katie and just to lead us into this question of alternatives.
No pressure, right? No, I think it's an excellent question and a very important one, and it's one that Tia and I spends a lot of our time and energy thinking about. I think, yeah, when you sent us the question in the preparation, I was thinking it's useful, I think, to talk about two different kinds or two different scales of alternatives, a kind of I don't quite want to say from below and from above, but I think on the one hand, we have examples, and they are many and they are wonderful, of what some people have called prefigurative alternatives. So grassroots mobilizations that really operate according to a different logic than the logic of capitalism, right? And that try to put into practice the question of what it looks like to put life at the center. So whether that is new forms of collective work and commoning coming out of the cooperative movement, whether that is women seed saving initiatives, which are happening across the world and that are revalorizing agroecology and traditional knowledge, whether that's CSAs, which form new forms of relationships between urban and rural communities, or CSAs, community supported agriculture. These are things that really directly in people's day-to-day life and practices recognize a different way of living and a different set of values. I think what we're increasingly seeing, which is very interesting, is also kind of pushes to scale some of these up to national levels and to really push for policies and for for states to support that role as well, and to embed a different logic. And we can see that happening, for example, in global calls for energy democracy and for energy systems that are built around people's needs and around a right to energy, for instance, rather than the current extractive model. And that's happening in a variety of places, but you also see national proposals for revalorization of care work, as for example, the conversations going on in Chile around a care wage and around a new way of constructing and thinking about care work. So these are, discussions at that level. And then the last kind of type of alternatives or type of conversation around alternatives that I'd like to point to is really the emergence of more and more convergence processes, as Mamadou also alluded to, that more and more movements are seeing their work and their struggles not in isolation, not as food movements, for example, but as part of wider articulations. And we see, for example, framings like just transition, which originated from labor movements, but is increasingly being used to bring in feminist struggles, indigenous struggles, climate justice, and a wide range of other struggles. So that attempt to kind of unify under a variety of different banners. And I think we're seeing similar discussions going on, for example, within food sovereignty movements that say we cannot see the questions of food sovereignty, critical and central as it is, in isolation from climate struggles, from land struggles, from feminist struggles, from anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles. And I think that convergence is happening in a number of different sites. Maybe that's enough for me to say.
Great, that's great. And Cassia?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that everything that Katie said is really interesting and important. I also want I'm energized by all of the anti-capitalist movements that Katie has identified that are speaking the language of climate change. But I think also that if we are looking for emancipatory alternatives, we shouldn't expect that these alternatives will always already speak the language of climate change, because as we've heard in a lot of places already over the last few days, the discourses of climate change are often felt to have been co-opted by capitalist political visions. This is certainly true in Bangladesh. So we've also heard from others during the conference that struggles for economic justice should be understood as struggles for climate justice, even when they don't claim that climate justice politics. So this is true both of the peasant movements that I've described in Bangladesh, and it's also true of the politics described by the scholars of Black and Indigenous studies that I just mentioned. I think that dominant conceptions of climate justice often leave out these visions that resist essentially capitalist ideologies of imminent crisis, and that we will need to look outside of these dominant framings of climate justice in order to identify alternative visions of anti-capitalist climate justice. So, Ricardo also asked about our role as scholars, and I think that as scholars, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to not let our own categories constrain ways of seeing connections between these political visions and struggles. We need to start our research programs by looking for anti-capitalist politics and then making the move to understand how those politics are shaped by and inform experience of and responses to climate change. The other day, Ruth talked about the need for climate action at multiple scales. And I think that it's pretty clear that it's necessary for anti-capitalism to be embedded in this action at every scale, but that it's not necessary to speak the language of climate justice at every scale as long as it's possible to create those connections. So just to recap, anti-capitalist approaches to climate justice may not speak the language of climate justice themselves, but we'll miss a lot of really important and emancipatory visions of climate changed futures if we don't work to unite these approaches in our own research and our own activism and work.
Great, and I will also just pose this question to Mamadou. What are some of the alternatives that you see emerging in Africa or the rest of the world? You're not constrained to just talk about Africa, but just to think about what is emerging on the continent or anywhere else that you want to articulate.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think that Katie and Cassia has been mentioning a lot of them that also are very vivid actually in the case of Africa. We have been talking about the food sovereignty movement that is actually backed up by agroecological approaches that as an alternative to a green revolution model that was really widely spread in many parts of African continent, but also the rest of the world. Actually, some key points related to that also have been pushing to create other movement around territorial market, for instance, as an alternative to the global market, because this is very important. There are now movement created around the territorial market that is linked to how the food system is linked to a production system, but also to the market system. So this is something very strong actually in West Africa, where people are trying to design and then to have public support for this movement around alternative to the global market. That has been collapsing in 2008. We know what happened. The same thing happened when COVID-19 came, how the shock at the global market with less than 20% of the food circulating has been contributing to create problems at different levels. And then the Russia and Ukraine conflict is also bringing the same thing. So now there are movements in Africa trying to find this alternative that is very relevant, just to look at how more food, where more food are circulating, can be also protected and promoted. And another point that is very important is the movement now around the co-creation of knowledge, because the university is more and more open now to social movement, and then contributing to create knowledge, and then also to as an alternative to what is done on climate research issue, and how we can just bring an anti-capitalistic view in this discussion around different segments of what people will call climate variability and the shock that they are facing to some extent. So these are some of the things that are happening on the fossil fuel issue. There are some alternatives that people are just trying to push around with all these artisanal movements that are created around the labor forces related to that. So these are some of the things that I will just emphasize on, and the convergences that have been mentioned by Katie around water and seed, how just to create conditions for more socializing these resources and make them more suitable for sustainable food systems and sustainable production systems.
Thank you. And if all of us just could also just, if we go to the audience, before I go to Diana, just also speak a little bit slower for the interpretation so that they can also just interpret what we are saying. But great, Mamadou, we're starting to look at an alternative, and it's an interesting question. And I'm as all of you have spoken, I'm trying to think the thing you are critiquing. Are you also not just reproducing capitalist alternatives? So, but we will come back to this question. But let me give to Diana in terms of what are some of these alternatives, and can we disentangle some of its elements?
I definitely agree with what Katie, Cassia, and Mamadou said. I think that alternatives are already here. That sometimes we think of the future as something that is to come, but then we realize that there are so many ways in which anti-capitalist struggles are happening in different sites, and with this widespread precarity and uncertainty, what we're seeing is also a lot of political mobilizations. And I think this past year has been very inspiring in different places, because they speak precisely of the point that Katie mentioned, and is how we see different banners, different movements coming together. And I agree also with Cassia that maybe it is not how we expected them to look like. And here I think that again, I see how a lot of the communitarian, indigenous, Black feminists in Latin America are precisely pointing to different ways to understanding politics. So to me, that would be, something that we as scholars can do, and is reframing what we understand as politics, what we understand that as where these big transformations that we need are happening, and they're happening precisely in smaller scales that are precisely connected with food, with water, with health, with housing, with those things that we tend to forget that are precisely what sustains life in the midst of this widespread precarity and uncertainty. And also the clarity that we're having from different movements about how there's not climate justice without a wider understanding of environmental justice, but without economic justice, without racial justice, without reproductive justice. All these things that are being connected and in a way are converging, I think that allow us to think of not futures that will come, but alternatives that are already here and that sometimes exist precisely because they're outside of the market and the state. Sometimes I feel like we go to the usual resource of the state as a way of getting out of here. And many of these movements and alternatives, what are showing us is that it is precisely because of the I don't want to say the failure of the state, because I don't believe in the failure of the state, but precisely because we have a capitalist state, because the state is precisely not on the side of sustaining life in different sites and in different places, that these alternatives exist. So to me, what we have to do, what we have to keep doing, is precisely disrupting these narratives, these commonsensical places that we usually go to, and thinking about how we can potentiate other ways of understanding politics and anti-capitalism in itself.
Thank you very much. And we will definitely, the question of the state in an alternative society is an important question, but we will come back to, and I hope you can keep that in mind, to think about the role of the state. And Mamadou started to raise that. And what is the role of the state, if there's any, for them in an anti-capitalist future? We will just go to the audience to just pose their questions, and I'll ask them to be very brief. I'll start with Ashok Trimali, just to pose your question. And I'm really asking just for everyone to be brief so that we can get the questions and the panelists to answer. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to raise the question to all panelists that how can we protect the inherent rights of indigenous community at the globe level? Because everybody is talking about the climate change and climate justice, but nobody is worried about the communities' rights on the natural resources. In other words, communities command over natural resources, whether it is a land, whether it is a forest, whether it is a water, or whether it is a fodder. So how can we protect? Because someone mentioned about the indigenous movement, about the feminist movement, everybody is fighting. But by day and day, more challenges emerging by capitalists. So how can we protect as a civil society organization? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. And we now go to Ana Victoria Portocarrero. Can you pose your question, please? Ana, no? Julia, can you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. I would like to apologize first because of my internet connection, so I cannot turn on my camera as well. Thanks a lot. So my question is actually more on, I would like to highlight on the race for domination by the current world's major powers, US versus China, through the competitions in controlling strategic field in semiconductor industry, digital technology, and artificial intelligence, and how it's going to shape the climate change, agrarian conflicts, and its advocacies, at least in the coming 10 years. I believe that everyone must have known about the current developing geopolitical conflict in Taiwan Strait between US and Taiwan versus China that is actually driven by political economic competition between US and China in semiconductor industry, and also US ambition to prevail in this field of digital technology and artificial intelligence against China. So for that purpose, US has already issued the latest CHIP Act with $52 billion budget allocations, plus various tax incentives to become world's first semiconductor producer. Because the current race world's major powers is projected to the one who succeeded in controlling semiconductor production, digital technology, and artificial intelligence, then it will become the contemporary ruler of the world. So I would say that we can foresee that at least in the coming 10 years, there will be an increasing competition and speed race for semiconductor raw materials, such as silica, manganese, copper, and other related mining materials. It means more expansion of exploitation areas across the southern world and across the world, basically. This also means that more demand of water for the production process and more chemical toxic waste. And the chip industry has a problem with its giant carbon footprint. Each new generation of semiconductors will require more energy, water, and greenhouse gases to create. But then, and meanwhile, exploitation locus in the South, such as my country, Indonesia, has already approached US for investment on these mining materials. So I would like to ask, actually, like in this context of geopolitical economic rivalry between US versus China, in order to become the world's major power, that comes with such intensity of conflict is definitely not a good sign for climate change, environmental justice, and human rights advocacies. It becomes a capitalist and imperialist business as usual from political and economic elites, both in US, China, and also European Union, especially in terms of semiconductor field. So I would like to, I'm interested actually to know all of your opinions on this issue, because then how it's going to shape later the climate change and agrarian conflicts, especially how we should respond to it in terms of building transnational alliance for advocacy. Because also with the fact that world's population right now, including us, is exponentially shaped to be dependent on digital technology and artificial intelligence. And I see this case is really alarming right now. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I'll just quickly, before I give back to the panelists, just quickly read Julian Latour's question. It says, hi, Diana, thank you for such an interesting exhibition. I would like to ask if the development of capitalism and the national productive industrial forces as proposed by the national government can hinder the change toward climate justice, especially when its development supposes the intense use of fossil fuels. There are inorganic fertilizers that requires the replication of the process at the regional level. What is the feminist position in this regard, particularly in the face of agrarian productive transition scenario? And that, I mean, that's directed to Diana, but I think it can for all of us. And then Anna Victoria's question is to all speakers, is on the emancipatory alternatives within constrained, authoritarian, and democratic societies, complicitness of government and how these alternatives can be realized, particularly in Africa, where there's quite a lot of undemocratic policy processes and wide violation of human rights. Any recommendation of possible solutions for coalition or alliance issues that voices and struggles of indigenous people, ethnic minorities are often sidelined by the state's interest or national agenda in a broader coalition of environmental climate justice movement. We just the last person to, I don't know if Leila Mehta is here to just briefly pose a question, but let's start with Diana and just go ahead to, you can, out of all the questions, you can select which one you want to just briefly comment on. Thank you.
Sure, Ricardo. I think that Julian's question has the answer already there, and it is a big no. Of course, that is not a way of getting out of here. If capitalism brought us here, capitalism is not going to be the solution. And one of the examples in my research has been is related to pesticides, and to me it is always an important point to note how in Colombia we see and criticize glyphosate used as a weapon of war, but we do not tend to see agrarian glyphosate. So your question is important and needs to be asked again and again. I see that Anna's question is about social reproduction and how it changes our perspective on this. It changes everything. I think that feminist Marxists have that very clear, that the question of social reproduction cannot be left out precisely in these moments, I think, where we're seeing that life and the mere reproduction of life is being put at halt. There's another question that is for all panelists about the state, so maybe we can also address that, but I'll stop there so we can keep answering all these very important questions. Thank you.
All right. Mamadou.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a few questions now. The first one from Ashok. I think there are very strong movement, indigenous movement that are actually very active at international level. It may be slow, but I think that things has been changing a bit. There is actually some specific cases that are addressed by this movement. What is happening actually at the CFS level, for instance, with which is the reason why the name of the CSM civil society mechanism I changed to CSIPM, just to include indigenous people struggle in, and then it has been also very instrumental in creating some additional conditions for some of the indigenous groups. So I know that this struggle, because actually there is a kind of false patriotism that is created in some extent in some countries just to prevent themselves of being addressed by international issues. But slowly, I think that things are moving a bit in some of the some African countries. There are very complicated situations like the case that we have in Cameroon or other regions. But for me, we still need this solidarity between movement and create conditions just to make pressure on some of the capitalist countries and how they are operating vis-a-vis indigenous groups. So there is a need to join also movement at different level. This is also in some cases, people are very reluctant just to join movement because they think it's too elitist. But I think that actually there are some room for that. The second point that I totally agree with Julia that there will be a lot of competition around some of the new resources. But I think also that in some extent, some countries actually, in the case of Africa, have been creating new models of accessing to some of the resources, even though we can say that there are many very controversial governance of some of the countries, but we can also realize that slowly there is a change that is happening on the mining sector particularly, because there is what we call an African mining vision that have been put into place. They are trying to see how to avoid this extractivism that is happening in the continent and create better conditions. And some countries are now have at least mining policies that didn't exist in the past. Have what we call that the different perspective around that will be just to create conditions for national investment in some of the mining systems. This is the case of my country, where actually there are some decisions in Mali that are trying to push for changing this trend of new material that you have been mentioning. Yeah, I think that I will stop here because some countries, they may be non-democratic, but in the regional integration processes, I think some are becoming a bit more open to realizing that this capitalist way of looking at this cannot allow the country to move forward. So yeah, I'm hopeful that social movements are pushing to change the trends in some countries. Mine is also part of that, and you can hear what is happening actually with France and others, and trying to just to control more of the resources in the country.
All right, thank you. That's great. So, Cassia, any response to what has been said so far?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say briefly in response to Ashok's question. I think that this is precisely the point. He said that why is there so much attention to conversations about climate justice, and there's a disconnect with discussions about community resource access. And yeah, as far as I'm concerned, we need to think about them together. We can't have agrarian climate justice without explicitly addressing questions of inequitable resource access within communities, and that any approach which doesn't recognize that questions of equitable resource distribution are questions of climate justice is not an anti-capitalist vision of climate justice. And I think that's something that has come through really clearly in like just throughout all presentations this week, actually, and that is sort of at the heart of this kind of emerging idea of what it means to think about anti-capitalist agrarian climate justice. So yeah, thanks for making that point really clearly, Ashok.
Great, and Katie?
Thanks. Yeah, I really agree with Katsia's response and framing. And thank you to everyone for these great questions. It's a struggle to know where to start. But I think that, yeah, aside from pointing out that incredibly important, the sort of unity between local struggles for land and resources and climate justice questions, I think that from Ashok and Julia's questions both, I also see that there's a really important question being posed here about the kind of the how. Like, say we all agree on this vision of agrarian climate justice, we don't necessarily hold the power to bring it about, right? How do we how do we do that? And that, of course, is not an easy question and not likely to be answered in the next 7 minutes of this webinar. But I think you know, part of what I wanted to say today is about the role of activist scholarship. And I think that one of the extremely important things that activist scholars can help with is in the project that we at TNI have usually referred to with the shorthand of study the rich, right? That there can be an extremely important role played by scholars at every level and in many different fields and positions in kind of posing and answering questions about where, for example, is capital advancing strategically, right? Where are, what are the kind of strategies of accumulation, and most critically, how can movements resist and contest those, right? So yeah, equally critical, where are there weaknesses or fractures, right? Where are there tensions, for example, between different fractions of capital, between national and international capital, between finance and industrial capital, between resource extraction on the one hand and between nationalist ends, you know, where are the weaknesses in the system that social movements and that people who are struggling for anti-capitalist or eco-socialist futures can get a foothold in, right? Because that's just an enormously complex strategic problem. And then linked to that as well, what are the political, like institutional and governance spaces where we can make some headway? And I think that ties to a question that was asked also in the chat about the state, and how can we have a more nuanced understanding of the state that realizes that it is not one unitary thing, which is wholly in service of capital or the, you know, pure democratic voice of the people, but that it's a space of contestation and a space where struggle is occurring, and that we in this case as movements can find allies within the state, but can also find just cracks and toeholds and places where a small amount of pressure applied at the right moment can suddenly make quite a big difference. And that, I think, is the kind of ongoing work of analysis that the movements are always doing, but where activist scholars can also make an enormous contribution. I wanted to talk about digitalization as well, because I think that's another enormously important question, but I think I should probably hand back to Ricardo to wrap up, and I will put some thoughts in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. We will just give 1 minute to Andrea Nightingale just to pose your question, and then we'll give everyone 2 seconds to answer your question. Go ahead, Andrea.
Sure. Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, hi, everyone. So yeah, my question really is that it seems to me that one of the big issues, especially when we're talking about the state, are questions of who becomes authorized to govern change. And if the state is not a monolith, we need to be asking questions about which levels of the state, and here I'm thinking both sectorally and kind of in a, you know, some kind of decentralized system, are perhaps the actors or the parts of the state that can help to authorize anti-capitalist movements and or anti-capitalist agendas. So I think it's a little naive to think that the state is just one thing and acting in one way.
Miriam, do you want to just pose your question in 1 second? Miriam Leferran? No?
Eh bien, oui, je vous remercie. Thank you very much. I had not planned on speaking. I simply wanted to bring forward that there are potentials in convergence that I have been attempting to implement for a couple of decades now, based on maybe 3 decades of looking at the environmental economic solutions that I didn't think would resolve the issues. And I'd be happy to talk about it some other time.
Okay, thank you. Diana, can you just in 30 seconds just give your final reflections and thoughts, responding also to the questions posed by Andrea?
Absolutely, 30 seconds or less. I think I agree with Andrea's point, and it is a very important one. And I would like to answer with something that Francia Marquez, that now is our vice president, said in her campaign, which I thought it was brilliant. We need to occupy the state to make it work against the violence it produces. I'm not quoting exactly, but that's the point, how this state to precisely make it work.
It seems we have lost Diana. Can we come back to Diana? Mamadou, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I think all the points has been mentioned. So we totally agree that the state has a role to play, but we don't have to be naive. And then there is a lot of reform that need to be done, and also creating this kind of conditions for bringing all the energies together. But I think that there is a lot to do, and social movement can contribute for this paradigm shift at a different level. So it's a long way to go, but I think that there is room for change, and then there is the role that academics have to play in creating also a condition for this education of the state as decision body in a different levels. You know.
Yes, thank you very much, Cassia.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess just very briefly, I think that Andrea's question is really brilliant, and it's a really good way to end this panel, because I think it speaks to the inadequacy of sort of dominant conceptions of global climate justice that rely on pursuing justice between states as sort of the key means of pursuing equity in a global climate regime. I think it's really clear that that a conception of climate justice that is pursued exclusively between states is not anti-capitalist and will not lead to agrarian climate justice, and that instead of thinking about politics sort of at that scale, we need to think about politics at multiple scales and how contestation can happen not only between states but also within states, and that needs to be pursued sort of within and between scales is sort of a more adequate means of thinking about climate justice, and specifically the only opportunity for thinking about anti-capitalist agrarian climate justice. So we'll talk about this more in session 16 following. Thanks so much to all my co-panelists for this really exciting conversation.
Thank you. And Katie, you have the last word.
That's a lot, and a lot to follow Cassia's excellent summation, I think. But no, indeed, I think that says it quite perfectly, that we need to see the state as a possible tool for social transformation, not as either the kind of end goal, and yeah, certainly not see states as the kind of only players in this discussion, because as all of you, I think, are deeply aware, you know, a single state encompasses huge amounts of inequality and difference. So I think the question is and needs to be how we formulate solutions from you know, grassroots movements and based around solidarity and around visions of a shared future. And then there is a nuanced sort of strategic and tactical question about how and where we can use states to advance those. And I think that will be enormously different in different contexts and in different spaces. But I think that it's a very rich conversation that can and should play out in transnational spaces like this one, where movements and activist scholars can come together to share those analyses and to build a collective understanding of what are the tools that we can use and how can we work, you know, with and through and against states, depending on the different situation, to bring about the kind of transformation that we really urgently need.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you, Diana, Mamadou, Cassia, and Katie, for a wonderful panel, and to all the participants that contributed, and the questions were great.